April 22, 1915, 5 p.m., the Western Front near Ypres, Belgium. For hours, French colonial troops and Canadian soldiers have been holding their positions in the trenches, enduring the monotonous hell of static warfare. But in the next few minutes, warfare itself would change forever. What they were about to witness would break every rule of civilized combat and open Pandora's box to a horror that would haunt battlefields for generations to come. This is the story of the day chemical warfare changed war forever. Imagine you're a soldier in a trench. You've survived artillery barges, machine gun fire, and the constant threat of sniper bullets. You think you know what war looks like. Then you see it, a yellow-green cloud rolling toward you like a living thing, hugging the ground, silent and unstoppable. Your eyes begin to burn. Your throat constricts. You can't breathe. Your lungs feel like they're on fire from the inside. This isn't battle. This is something else entirely. Something inhuman. The attack at Ypres lasted only 10 minutes, but its impact would last a century. It killed thousands, injured tens of thousands more, and transformed warfare into something far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. Today, we're going to tell a complete story, how it happened, why it happened, and how it changed the rules of war forever. To understand why the Germans turned to chemical weapons, we need to understand the situation on the Western Front in early 1915. When war broke out in August 1914, everyone expected it to be over by Christmas. Millions of young men marched off to war with flowers in their rifles, believing in glory, honor, and quick victory. They were catastrophically wrong. By the winter of 1914, the war had ground to a halt, from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Two massive armies faced each other across a line of trenches that would barely move for the next 4 years. This was the Western Front. 400 miles of mud, barbed wire, and death. The German High Command was frustrated. They were fighting a two-front war against France and Britain in the west and Russia in the east. They needed a breakthrough, something to break the stalemate and force the Allies to negotiate. Traditional tactics, artillery barges followed by infantry charges, had proven suicidal. Machine guns cut down attacking soldiers by the thousands. Something new was needed. That something new would come from chemistry. Germany in 1914 was the world leader in chemistry. Its universities and industrial laboratories had pioneered synthetic dyes, pharmaceuticals, and chemical processes that powered the modern world. Names like Bayer, BASF, and Hoechst were already industrial giants. Among Germany's leading chemists was Fritz Haber, a brilliant, ambitious scientist who would soon become one of the most controversial figures in history. Haber had already revolutionized agriculture by inventing a process to synthesize ammonia from nitrogen in the air, the Haber-Bosch process. This discovery would eventually feed billions of people. But Haber was also a patriot. When war broke out, he immediately offered his expertise to the German military. Haber proposed something radical, the use of poison gas as a weapon. The idea wasn't entirely new. Chemical agents had been used in limited ways before, but Haber envisioned something far more systematic and devastating. He argued that a properly deployed gas attack could break through enemy lines, save German lives, and end the war quickly. Many German officers were skeptical. The Hague Convention of 1899 had prohibited the use of poison or poison weapons in warfare, but Haber found a loophole. The convention banned projectiles filled with poison gas, but said nothing about releasing gas from cylinders. It was a technicality, but in the desperate context of 1915, it was enough. The German High Command gave Haber permission to proceed. The weapon of choice, chlorine gas. Chlorine is a greenish-yellow gas, heavier than air, with a distinctive, choking odor. When inhaled, it reacts with the moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid, essentially burning the respiratory system from the inside. Victims drown in the fluid that fills their damaged lungs. It's an agonizing death. Haber's plan was to install thousands of gas cylinders along a section of the German front line, wait for favorable wind conditions, and then release a massive cloud of chlorine toward the enemy trenches. The gas would flow into the trenches like a liquid, suffocating or driving out the defenders, allowing German troops to advance through the gap. The target was chosen, Ypres. Ypres was a medieval Flemish city in Belgium, with cobblestone streets, Gothic architecture and the magnificent cloth hall dominating its central square. For centuries, it had been a center of trade and culture. Now, it was on the front line of the Great War. The city itself was already in ruins, pounded by German artillery. But the area around Ypres, the Ypres salient, was strategically vital. It was a bulge in the Allied lines that pushed into German-held territory. Defending it were French colonial troops from North Africa, along with Canadian and British forces. The Germans had already tried twice to capture Ypres in 1914, suffering horrific casualties. Now, in April 1915, they were preparing for a third attempt. But this time, they had a secret weapon. Throughout March and early April 1915, German troops quietly installed 5,730 cylinders of chlorine gas along a 4-mile section of the front line near the villages of Langmark and Poelcapelle. Each cylinder contained about 40 kilograms of liquefied chlorine under pressure. In total, they had 168 tons of gas, enough to create a cloud that would engulf the Allied trenches. The soldiers who installed the cylinders were told they were a new type of smokescreen. Only a handful of officers knew the truth. Now, all they needed was the right wind. For 3 weeks, the Germans waited. The gas had to be released when the wind was blowing toward the Allied lines. Steady but not too strong, or the gas would disperse too quickly. Too weak, it might blow back toward German positions. Day after day, Haber and his team checked the weather. The cylinders sat in the trenches, a deadly secret. German soldiers knew something was coming, but not what. Then, on April 22nd, the conditions were finally right. A steady breeze was blowing from the northeast, directly toward the French positions. At 5 p.m., the order was given, release the gas. German soldiers wearing primitive respirators, cotton pads soaked in sodium thiosulfate. Open the valves on the cylinders. With a hiss, the liquefied chlorine began to evaporate and pour out. At first, it was just wisps of yellowish-green vapor. But within minutes, the wisps became streams, and the streams became a wall. The gas, heavier than air, hugged the ground and rolled forward like a slow-motion tidal wave. It flowed across no man's land, over the barbed wire, and into the Allied trenches. The French troops saw it coming. At first, they didn't understand what they were seeing. Some thought it was a smoke screen for a German attack. Others noticed a strange color, yellow-green, like nothing they'd seen before. A few caught the smell, sharp, choking, like a mixture of bleach and pineapple. Then the gas reached the trenches, and the horror began. The chlorine gas sank into the trenches like water pouring into a ditch. There was no escape. Men began to cough, then choke. Their eyes burned and watered. They couldn't catch their breath. The gas was burning their lungs from the inside. Those who tried to breathe deeply to get air only sucked more gas into their lungs. Within minutes, men were collapsing, gasping, their faces turning blue from lack of oxygen. Some vomited. Others bled from the nose and mouth as their lung tissue dissolved. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones suffered for hours, drowning in the fluid that filled their lungs. The gas cloud was 6 feet high and 4 miles wide. It rolled through the French positions for about 10 minutes, pushed by the steady breeze. An estimated 6,000 men died in those 10 minutes, suffocated by invisible poison. Another 10,000 were injured, many permanently disabled. The French lines disintegrated. Survivors fled in panic, running toward Ypres, creating a gap in the Allied defenses 4 miles wide. For a brief moment, the road to Ypres, and potentially the entire Allied position, lay open. Behind the gas cloud came German infantry. They advanced cautiously, wearing their primitive respirators, not entirely sure the gas had dissipated. What they found was a scene from hell. Trenches filled with dead and dying men, equipment abandoned, rifles, ammunition, artillery pieces, all left behind as the defenders fled or perished. It was an unprecedented breakthrough. But here's the historical irony. The Germans didn't expect it to work so well. They had planned a gas attack as an experiment, a trial run before a major offensive elsewhere. They didn't have enough reserve troops in position to exploit the breakthrough. The German advance pushed forward 2 miles, then stopped. They consolidated their gains, but went no further. By nightfall, Canadian troops had rushed to fill the gap, creating a new defensive line. The opportunity was lost. Still, the gas attack had been devastatingly effective. The Germans had achieved a breakthrough that months of conventional attacks had failed to accomplish, and they had done it with relatively few German casualties. The age of chemical warfare had begun. 2 days later, on April 24th, the Germans attacked again, this time targeting Canadian positions northeast of Ypres. Once again, they released chlorine gas. But this time, the Allies were slightly better prepared. Word of the gas attack had spread. Canadian officers quickly realized what they were facing and improvised a defense. They instructed their men to urinate on handkerchiefs or any piece of cloth and hold it over their nose and mouth. The ammonia in urine partially neutralized the chlorine gas. It was crude, disgusting, and only marginally effective, but it saved lives. The Canadians held their positions. Though thousands were gassed, they didn't break and run. They fought back even as they choked and gasped, firing at the advancing Germans through the gas cloud. It was an act of extraordinary courage under unimaginable conditions. The Second Battle of Ypres would continue until May 25th, with repeated gas attacks and conventional fighting. By the end, the Ypres salient had shrunk, but it held. The Allies had adapted to the new threat. The psychological shock of the first gas attack had worn off, but the genie was out of the bottle. Chemical warfare was now a part of modern war. The testimonies from survivors are harrowing. One French soldier described the gas as a wall of greenish vapor that killed everything. A Canadian officer wrote, "The effect was so terrible that for a moment my mind refused to accept the evidence of my eyes." A British medical officer described the casualties. The faces of the men were blue and their breathing was labored. They were drowning on dry land. He had never seen anything like it in his medical training. Doctors were helpless. There was no treatment for chlorine gas poisoning except time and rest, and many didn't survive long enough to recover. The psychological impact was perhaps even more profound than the physical casualties. Soldiers could face bullets and shells. Those were visible threats that could be fought. But gas was invisible, insidious, and terrifying. You couldn't shoot it. You couldn't hide from it. It violated something fundamental about what warfare was supposed to be. One soldier summed it up simply. Gas doesn't give you a chance. It just kills you while you stand there. News of the gas attack spread quickly. Allied newspapers denounced it as barbaric, a violation of civilized warfare. The Germans were portrayed as monsters who would stop at nothing. Propaganda posters showed German soldiers as devils releasing poison, and the Hun as the enemy of humanity itself. The Germans defended their actions. They claimed they were technically within the Hague Convention rules, since they hadn't used projectiles filled with gas. They also argued that gas was more humane than conventional weapons. It caused fewer deaths per attack than artillery or machine guns, and many of the injured recovered. This argument was coldly logical but morally bankrupt. Yes, gas killed fewer people per attack than shells. But it killed them in the most horrifying way possible, and it violated an unspoken boundary about what weapons were acceptable in war. The international community was outraged, but there was no mechanism to enforce international law during wartime. The League of Nations didn't exist yet. The Hague Convention had no teeth. The only response was retaliation, and retaliate they did. Within months, the Allies were developing their own chemical weapons. Britain established a dedicated chemical warfare program under the Royal Engineers. France mobilized its chemical industry. By September 1915, just 5 months after Ypres, British forces launched their first chlorine gas attack against German positions at the Battle of Loos. The attack was a disaster. The wind shifted, blowing the gas back toward British lines. British soldiers were gassed by their own weapons. The attack achieved nothing and demonstrated the unpredictability of gas as a weapon. But that didn't stop the escalation. By 1916, both sides were using gas regularly. And they weren't just using chlorine anymore. Chemical weapons evolved rapidly. Phosgene, a colorless gas that was far more deadly than chlorine, became a preferred weapon by 1916. Unlike chlorine's immediate effects, phosgene could take 24 hours to kill you. Soldiers exposed to phosgene might feel fine at first, then suddenly collapse hours later as their lungs fill with fluid. Then came mustard gas in 1917, the most feared of all. Mustard gas didn't kill quickly, but it caused terrible burns on any exposed skin, blinded victims, and caused agonizing internal injuries. It persisted in the environment for days, contaminating soil and water. It was indiscriminate and cruel. By the end of World War I, both sides had fired approximately 124,000 tons of chemical weapons. The Germans used the most gas initially, but by war's end, the Allies had matched and exceeded German chemical warfare capabilities. Chemical weapons killed approximately 90,000 soldiers and injured over 1 million. That's roughly 4% of all casualties in the war. But the psychological impact was far greater than the numbers suggest. Every soldier on the Western Front lived in constant fear of gas attack. The gas mask became the symbol of World War I, even more than the steel helmet or the trench. It represented the dehumanization of modern war, turning men into insect-like creatures, robbing them of their faces and voices. Gas mask technology evolved rapidly. The first masks were just cotton pads soaked in chemicals. Within a year, proper respirators with filters and face seals were standard issue for all soldiers. By 1917, gas masks were sophisticated devices with replaceable filters, anti-fogging systems, and comfortable face pieces. But wearing a gas mask was miserable. They were hot, claustrophobic, and made every activity more difficult. You couldn't eat, drink, or communicate effectively while wearing one. Your field of vision was restricted. Your breathing was labored. Some soldiers developed panic attacks from confined feeling. Every soldier carried a gas mask at all times. Gas alarms, bells, rattles, or horns were positioned throughout the trenches. At the first sign of gas, soldiers had seconds to get their masks on. Those who were too slow, or whose masks didn't seal properly, became casualties. The gas mask worked. It saved countless lives. But it also meant that chemical warfare had become normalized, just another aspect of trench warfare that soldiers had to endure. What happened to Fritz Haber, the scientist who started it all? During the war, he was celebrated in Germany as a patriot and a genius. He was promoted to captain, then director of Germany's chemical warfare program. He personally supervised gas attacks, including the one at Ypres. He saw himself as a problem solver, using science to save German lives and end the war quickly. But his wife, Clara Immerwahr, also a chemist, was horrified by his work. She believed he had perverted science, turning it from a tool of human progress into a weapon of mass suffering. She argued with him bitterly about the morality of chemical weapons. On May 2, 1915, just 10 days after the Ypres attack, Clara Immerwahr shot herself in the heart with Haber's military pistol. She died in their son's arms. Whether her suicide was entirely because of her husband's work or other factors remains debated, but it's clear his chemical warfare research was a major cause of their conflict. Haber was devastated but didn't change course. He continued developing chemical weapons throughout the war. After Germany's defeat in 1918, he faced possible war crimes charges and briefly fled to Switzerland. But he was never prosecuted. In 1918, the same year the war ended, Haber was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, not for his weapons work, but for his pre-war invention of ammonia synthesis. The timing was controversial. Many saw it as rewarding a war criminal. Haber's story doesn't end there. In the 1920s, he developed Zyklon A, a pesticide for fumigating grain storage. After his death in 1934, chemists working for the Nazis modified it into Zyklon B, the poison gas used in the Holocaust to murder millions, including Haber's own relatives. Haber, who was Jewish, had fled Nazi Germany in 1933 and died in exile, rejected by the country he had served. His legacy is perhaps the most morally complex of any scientist in history, a man who invented a process that feeds billions and weapons that kill millions. The suffering didn't end when the war ended. Thousands of gas victims lived with permanent lung damage, blindness, and chronic pain for decades after 1918. Many developed what we would now recognize as PTSD, triggered by smells that reminded them of gas. Chlorine from swimming pools, certain industrial chemicals, even strong perfumes. They lived in constant fear of another gas attack that would never come. Veterans advocacy groups pushed for recognition and compensation for gas casualties, but governments were often reluctant to provide adequate support. Chemical weapon injuries were difficult to prove and document. Many victims were told their symptoms were psychological. The environmental impact lasted for decades. Chemical weapons buried or dumped after the war continued to leak. In France and Belgium, areas of the Western Front remained contaminated for years. Even today, over a century later, farmers occasionally unearth corroded gas shells. They're still dangerous. The legacy of Ypres reached far beyond the battlefield. The world was horrified by chemical warfare. After the war ended, there was a strong push to ban it forever. In 1925, the major powers signed the Geneva Protocol, formerly known as the Protocol for the Prohibition of the Use and War of Asphyxiating, Poisonous, or Other Gases, and of Bacteriological Methods of Warfare. It was a major step forward, but it had significant loopholes. The protocol banned the use of chemical weapons in war, but not their development, production, or stockpiling. Many nations ratified it with reservations, basically saying they wouldn't use gas first, but reserved the right to retaliate if attacked with gas. Still, the taboo against chemical weapons was strong. In World War II, despite both sides possessing massive chemical weapon stockpiles, they were rarely used on the battlefield. Hitler, himself a gas victim in World War I, reportedly refused to authorize their use against Allied troops, though he had no such qualms about using Zyklon B against civilians in the Holocaust. But the taboo wasn't absolute. Chemical weapons were used in colonial wars, civil conflicts, and by authoritarian regimes against their own people. The weapons that debuted at Ypres continued to kill throughout the 20th century. Despite the Geneva Protocol, chemical weapons never truly went away. Italy used mustard gas against Ethiopian forces in 1935-36. Japan used chemical weapons extensively during its invasion of China in the 1930s and 40s, killing thousands of Chinese soldiers and civilians. During the Cold War, both superpowers developed even more deadly nerve agents, sarin VX tibulin, chemicals so toxic that a single drop on skin could kill within minutes. These weapons were never used in direct superpower conflict, but they proliferated to dozens of countries. In 1980-88, during the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq used chemical weapons extensively against Iranian troops. It was the largest use of chemical weapons since World War I. Saddam Hussein's regime also used chemical weapons against Iraqi Kurds, most notoriously in the 1988 Halabja attack that killed thousands of civilians. In the 1990s, the Tokyo subway sarin attack by the Aum Shinrikyo cult demonstrated that chemical weapons could be used by non-state actors. 13 people died and thousands were injured when sarin was released in subway cars during rush hour. More recently, chemical weapons have been used in Syria's civil war, including multiple sarin and chlorine attacks that have killed thousands. Russian-made nerve agents have been used in assassination attempts in the UK. The weapons Fritz Haber unleashed at Ypres in 1915 are still killing people today, more than a century later. Finally, in 1997, the Chemical Weapons Convention came into force, a comprehensive ban on chemical weapons that goes far beyond the Geneva Protocol. The CWC bans not just the use of chemical weapons, but their development, production, stockpiling, and transfer. It requires countries to destroy existing stockpiles under international verification. As of 2024, 193 countries are party to the convention, nearly every nation on Earth. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, oversees the treaty, conducting inspections and verifying destruction. For this work, the OPCW was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2013. Approximately 72,000 metric tons of chemical weapon agents have been verifiably destroyed under the CWC, enough to kill every person on Earth many times over. It's one of the most successful arms control treaties in history. But the work isn't finished. Some countries still haven't joined the CWC. Others have used chemical weapons in violation of it. And the knowledge of how to make these weapons can never be destroyed. It's preserved in scientific literature, accessible to anyone with training in chemistry. The box that opened at Ypres can never be fully closed. Today, the threat of chemical weapons persists in new forms. Terrorist groups have attempted to acquire them. The collapse of states in the Middle East has raised fears that chemical weapon stockpiles could fall into the wrong hands. Meanwhile, advances in chemistry and biology have created new possibilities for weapons. Scientists worry about advances in synthetic biology that could enable engineered pathogens. The same technologies that promise miracle drugs could also create nightmare weapons. We've seen the playbook before. The scientific breakthrough, initially intended for beneficial purposes, perverted into a weapon. Haber's chlorine gas was used in water purification before it killed at Ypres. The Haber-Bosch process that made explosives and poison gas also makes fertilizer that feeds billions. The lesson of Ypres is that once a weapon is conceived, it's nearly impossible to uninvent. The only defense is vigilance, international cooperation, and a strong moral consensus that some weapons are beyond the pale, that some lines should never be crossed. But Ypres also teaches us that in the desperation of war, nations will cross any line if they believe it will bring victory. Today, Ypres has been rebuilt. The Cloth Hall stands again, reconstructed stone by stone after the war. The city is peaceful and prosperous, showing no obvious scars of the carnage it witnessed. But the memory of the gas attack is preserved. The Menin Gate Memorial bears the names of 54,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who died in the Ypres salient and have no known grave, many of them gas victims whose bodies were never recovered. Every night at 8 p.m. since 1928, traffic stops at the Menin Gate and buglers play the last post, a ritual of remembrance that has continued through peace and war, through German occupation in World War II and into the present day. Near Langmark, where the gas was first released, there are museums and cemeteries. Guided tours take visitors through preserved trenches. Farmers still occasionally find gas shells, rusted but still deadly, and call specialized bomb disposal teams to remove them. The ground around Ypres is sacred. It's soaked in blood and poison, and the memory of what happened there should never fade. So was Fritz Haber right? Was chemical warfare more humane than conventional weapons? The statistics might support his argument. Chemical weapons cause about 4% of World War I casualties, far less than artillery and machine guns. Many gas victims recovered, while artillery wounds were often fatal or led to amputations. But this misses the point entirely. Humanity has always made distinctions between acceptable and unacceptable weapons. We instinctively recoil from certain methods of killing. Poison has been considered dishonorable since ancient times. There's something about gas, invisible, insidious, causing agony rather than clean death. That violates our sense of what warfare should be. Perhaps that instinct is correct. Perhaps some weapons are so cruel, so indiscriminate, so likely to cause unnecessary suffering, that they should be banned regardless of their military effectiveness. The Geneva Convention draws lines. Gas weapons are legal, but bullets and bombs are not. Are these lines arbitrary? Perhaps. But without them, warfare becomes truly unlimited, a descent into barbarism where anything goes. Ypres marked a line that was crossed, and the world collectively decided it should never have been. The century-long effort to ban chemical weapons represents humanity's attempt to maintain some shred of civilization, even in the midst of industrialized slaughter. It's an imperfect effort, but it's better than nothing. In the end, perhaps we should listen to soldiers themselves, the men who experienced gas warfare firsthand. The British poet Wilfred Owen, who fought on the Western Front, witnessed a gas attack. He described in his poem Dulce et decorum estate, the title ironic, meaning it is sweet and fitting die for one's country. Owen's poem describes watching a man who failed to get his gas mask on in time. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. As under a green sea, I saw him drowning. Owen's conclusion, the old lie, dulce et decorum est / pro patria mori. There's nothing sweet about dying for your country when you're drowning in poison gas. The soldiers knew the truth. There was nothing humane about chemical warfare. It was simply another way to die, and one of the worst. April 22nd, 1915, changed warfare forever. In 10 minutes, 168 tons of chlorine gas killed thousands and ushered in an era of chemical warfare that would haunt the 20th century. The attack at Ypres demonstrated that science could be weaponized in ways never before imagined. It showed that in total war, nations would cross any moral boundary if they believed it would bring victory. And it proved that once a weapon is invented, it's almost impossible to control its spread. But the century since Ypres has also shown something else, that humanity can choose to reject certain weapons, that international law and moral consensus can create real restraints, even in warfare, that the arc of history, however slowly, can bend toward limits on barbarism. Today, chemical weapons are banned, their stockpiles being destroyed, their use almost universally condemned. It's an imperfect victory. Violations still occur, and the threat hasn't been eliminated entirely. But compared to the world in 1915, when gas warfare was a new and spreading horror, we've come a long way. The soldiers who died at Ypres, choking on chlorine gas, couldn't have known that their suffering would eventually lead to a global ban on the weapons that killed them. But perhaps that's their legacy, a world that decided some methods of war are simply too horrific to tolerate. We remember Ypres not just as the day chemical warfare was born, but as the day humanity began its long, difficult journey to eliminate it. Let us never forget the price of that lesson. Let us never repeat it. If you found this documentary informative, please subscribe, and share. Understanding history helps us avoid repeating its worst mistakes. For more on World War I and the history of chemical weapons, check the sources in the description below. Thank you for watching. Remember the fallen. Learn from the past. Build a better future.